Welcome to Hacker Heap. In this tutorial, we will look into the introduction to GraphQL and we will build a GraphQL server using the Apollo GraphQL library. We will see the difference between REST API and GraphQL, and we will see how the GraphQL interface is and how to work with the GraphQL interface. So let's dive in.
So what is GraphQL? GraphQL is new API standard that provides a more efficient and powerful alternative to REST. And GraphQL is basically a query language for APIs, and it's the most efficient alternative to the REST APIs. GraphQL was developed by Facebook and it has been open sourced in 2015 in the React.js conference. We'll see the difference between the REST APIs and the GraphQL APIs. So if you see the traditional REST APIs in the picture, if you want to get the users of a particular ID, you should have one endpoint, and if you want to get the posts for that particular user, you need to use a different endpoint. And similarly, if you want to get followers of that particular user, you need to use a different get endpoint. You need to define those endpoints independently to get these values. Whereas in GraphQL, you just define the schema and you only use one endpoint and you define what do you need in the response. If you see here, the query object contains the user, the name, the post, and the title of the post and the followers. This single endpoint will get you all the details. If you just need the post of that particular user with the ID, you just define user and post title. You don't have to define the followers, and it will just return the first part of the response and it won't return the followers. And if you just need the followers, you can just eliminate the posts object in the request and it will just return the followers object in the response. So GraphQL, you don't have to define multiple endpoints to get this data. You just need one single endpoint and you need to define the schema definition and it will return the response you required. So this eliminates a lot of latency in the transportation. Like if there is a big object, in general, we don't use all the REST response. We will only be needing few of those details. So you can just ask for what you need so that GraphQL can send exactly what you need and not all the crap that you don't need. And it will also reduce the latency and increases the response speed when there is less data to transfer. Now we will look into setting up a simple GraphQL schema and see how it works in real time. We will expose a GraphQL API using Apollo server in JavaScript. I will go ahead and create the project from scratch. I'm creating the directory, changing to the directory. I'm creating a folder for server. I'll go ahead and open my Visual Studio Code where I will start writing the code. I have my server folder open here. I'll go ahead and create a file package.json where I will add all the dependencies that are required for setting up the GraphQL server. For now, I'll just give the name server and I will just leave it here, and I'll open the terminal and install Apollo server and GraphQL. The GraphQL package contains all the core GraphQL functionalities. So now the dependencies got added, the Apollo server and GraphQL. I will go ahead and create a file called server.js where I will define the schema and the resolver and create the server. The first thing we need to do is define the schema object. I will do it by just defining a variable called typedef, which means defining the type definitions, and it's like defining a class in JavaScript, except that instead of using the keyword class, we will use the keyword type. Type query greeting and type string. That's it. We defined the schema saying that this API, the GraphQL API which we are about to expose, will have only one variable saying greeting and it will be exposed. And we can pass the schema using a function called GQL, which we can import from Apollo server. I'll go ahead and import the GQL function from Apollo server. Now I had this imported. I will tag this as GQL string. When the GraphQL reads this, it will know that this is not a normal string and it is actually a GraphQL string query. Now we had the type definition. We need to define the resolver, which is again a variable which says how to return the response when this particular API is being called. So the type definition and the resolver should have the same number of variables. We have defined greeting, so in this it should be greeting and it should be nothing different than that, and we will return hello world. What it does is, when we are trying to query the GraphQL endpoint, and if you want the greeting object, it will return hello world. But in the real world, we will be calling something else in the backend. But for this basic example, we are just returning the hello world. Now we defined the resolvers and we need to set the Apollo server. For this, I need to import one more function called Apollo server from the Apollo server. Once we add this, we will go ahead and define the server. Again, it's a constant variable, new Apollo server. Apollo server will take a couple of parameters. Two of them are the type definitions and the resolvers corresponding to the type definitions. So we will go ahead and pass the type definition and resolver to the Apollo server. The type defs we defined and the resolver function we defined. That's it. So, and we need start the port in, we will define the port here, which will listen to the 9000 port, which is the default port that GraphQL runs on. Now let's print out where the server is actually running. So once we are listening to that, we will get the server info, which we can use to print any server related details. Server info is our definition, and we will log saying server running at, and we have the server info dot. If you see here, it already shows the URL. I'll go ahead and print it. That's all we need. Now I will go ahead and run node server.js, which will run the server. So if you see, the server is running at localhost 9000. Now let's go ahead and open the localhost 9000 port and see what's there. If you see this, it actually had a UI saying the GraphQL Playground. This is provided by GraphQL library that we added. It's a playground where you can query different things. If you observe, I started writing the query and it already showed me, hey, you can query localhost 9000. You can hit 9000 and get these variables. So all we defined right now is a greeting variable. So the response would just return the greeting. I selected it and run it. If you see, it returned me the greeting. Now let's go back and add a couple of other variables and see how it acts. So in my server.js, I will go ahead and add one more variable saying ID, which is a string, user, which is a string. I have added these two. Similarly, we have to define the resolvers for these two variables as well. So I have to define ID similarly the user hacker heap. So I will go ahead and start the server again and see what we get this time. So the server is running at the same port. I will go back and refresh the server and type to give ID. If you see here, now it showed me ID as well as the user object if you try to give. So it returned me the ID. This is ID and hacker heap. If you want to see what all variables that are available in the response, see, this provides the GraphQL interface, the Playground interface provides docs and schema. If you click on the schema, it will show you the type of the query, and it has all different values that it can send. And if you see the docs, it will show you what you can query. The greetings is of type string, ID is of type string, and user is of type string. But you can also define complex data types like user with the ID and all that stuff. So this is basic introduction to GraphQL. So if you are using a REST API, if you want to get just the value of the greeting and not ID and user, you need to have three different endpoints, like let's say getting a greeting or getting an ID or getting a user. Whereas here you can use just one endpoint and ask for whatever you need. If I say like I don't need ID, what I would do is I will just remove the ID and hit the endpoint. It will just give me the greeting and the user. If you decided not to get greeting for whatever reason, you can just remove that and just say, hey, I just need a user. That's it. So this is the beauty of GraphQL. It actually sends what you need and it will eliminate all the crap that you don't need. This is more useful when the response is a very big object and you just need very few variables inside the object. This comes in like pretty useful and reduces a lot of latency. So when you are using a mobile app where the network is pretty slow, if the mobile app had a GraphQL implementation and when it tries to load the page, it will get what are the required variables and not the whole lot of crap, which will take a lot of data for the mobile app to import from the server. With this, it can just import the username or it can just import the greeting, depends on what the mobile app needs. So it eliminates that latency and provides a very good flexibility which REST API doesn't provide. So this is the basic introduction to GraphQL. I hope it helps.